So I'm Vlad. Thanks for the intros. So we're going to talk about DAC again, which you heard a little bit about if you're here for the last session. And we're going to talk about it through the context of some of the stuff that we're involved in the Roussel community through Switzerland and beyond. And then also sort of applying those principles in the development of like large language models within AI and other aspects like biodefense and cyber. So before we get to our nice panel discussion here, I want to step back and compare and contrast the DAC movement, defensive acceleration versus effective accelerationism. So let's start with EAC. How many people here have heard of EAC? Okay, so we're familiar here. So EAC is sort of like the extreme version of tech acceleration. It's the very like capitalist, profit-driven version of it. Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz up here is one of the big proponents of it. I think we're currently in the US in an administrative environment that's very supportive of this approach, which is just basically remove all regulatory barriers, just unencumbered tech progress, let it be market-driven, winner-take-all sort of environment. And then by doing this, you sort of like achieve a utopian version of humanity. That's sort of the vision there. Whether or not you agree with that is open to interpretation. We've seen things like OpenAI. They prefer like closed source models and just, pushing their advantages through just like standard like capitalist competition. Okay. DAC, which we covered a little bit, or Ayla and Una covered a little bit in the last session. That's something that Vitalik published an article about. Some of the key principles there are for technological advancement to focus on safety and making the world better, which he doesn't necessarily define those, how you measure those things, but at least it provides us with a framework. Again, a heavy emphasis on decentralization, which is obviously very core to what we do here with Ethereum and blockchain in general. And then just consider the ethical considerations of what we're doing. Are these like improve societal well-being? Is there a focus on safety? So let's go through some of the key points of DAC. So this demand for new approaches, that's sort of the high-level thing. A world leading towards defense. So everything we do, we take sort of a defensive perspective of like, what are the worst-case scenarios that could happen as we develop these technologies? And that is both what he calls macro, so infrastructure, so things like internet infrastructure, such as Starlink as a defensive technology. The interesting thing about Starlink using that is that it is centralized, so that gets more into like a deepened conversation potentially. Biomedical, again, preventing things like airborne pandemics. Vitalik's very much concerned about what happened with COVID and the future of sort of like biological warfare. And then we get into more like cryptography, blockchain network defense, information defense. So one thing that's called out is like Twitter's community notes. But basically, content moderation I think is super important. Also using decentralized social platforms to combat some of the centralized platforms out there today. We've seen with Elon buying Twitter that he's basically made it his sort of platform and crafting it in his vision. He'll argue that it's done under the guise of like, I'm releasing free speech, but it's really free speech under Elon's sort of rule. So creating more decentralized, neutral platforms for social engagement is important as well. Cool. That's sort of the setup. Let's get into our panel discussion. So I'm going to leave. This is Meerkat, which Miriam will talk about shortly. This is a great platform for just like engaging with us. So as we have our conversation, you're welcome to scan that QR code, submit questions. Those questions go up here. You guys can upvote questions you like, and we can just pick them off here for the last part of this session. Cool. All right. So let's get into some conversations here. So I want to start with some Zuzalu-related tech stuff, and I'm going to start with Veronica. So Veronica, first, I'd love for you to do an intro on your involvement with Zuzalu and sort of the tech-related things that you're involved in. And then what I want to start with is maybe go into some of the specific aspects of Zuzalu's open source tech movement and maybe distinguish how it differs from other sort of decentralized initiatives.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Veronica, and I brought these up so I could do the bit. I wear two hats currently in the Zuzalu movement. I'm supporting operations for Switzerland, which you heard about, and I'm leading operations for Zuzalu.city. I've also been engaged participant, a community movement member since the original experiment in Montenegro in 2023. So the question specifically to what is Zulu software movement, what are we trying to do, how does it differentiate? I think a key differentiation is, so compared to maybe regular decentralized projects that are working on a single protocol, we can see Zulu software movement as broadly different projects and teams working together to build tools, not empires, in Vitalik's words, and make Ethereum cypherpunk again. We have that even on stickers that I'm out of because everyone wanted them. I think that does encompass a bit of this ethos of, all right, we have a lot of different teams. Ethereum Community Fund, ECF, of course, is one team that's working on Zulu software, and then a variety of different projects coming together to solve problems that communities have, like Zulu. And I use communities in a very broad sense because we're trying to solve maybe for people that want to create something generational. Maybe they call it a network state, maybe not. It's a startup society, it's a new city, or just a community that wants to own their own data for the tools that they're using. So what that looks like then practically is, all right, if you're self-organizing as a community, you're using a scheduling service, and now you're beholden to that scheduling service to, one, not censor or block you from organizing those events, and to keep your data for forever if in 20, 30, 50 years you want to be able to prove that you were contributing. So on our level, I'm seeing these questions come up. I was wondering what the reactions are. I guess it's from this. So we're together building tools to solve real-world use cases by communities that maybe have permanent or temporary hubs. Pop-up city is one. That's how the Zulu movement began, was with a temporary pop-up city. We're seeing increasingly permanent ambitions towards permanence. So we call it maybe permanent Zulu nodes or permanent crypto hubs, and then asking what are the problems or what are the specific use cases that we need. Maybe we need decentralized messaging. All right, so Status can solve that in theory. Zulu.city is also building, as QJ mentioned earlier, you can think of it like a DApp store or a community operating system. And at a baseline, we want to stay neutral, which I imagine we'll get into when we talk about what are the values. We want to be as neutral as possible, but provide the option for, say, privacy and use our own data for the users. There's a lot to go into along those sides.
For sure. I want to give everybody a chance to maybe tackle this a little bit. So one of the interesting things about the platform we're using here to submit your questions, Meerkat, is a project that came out of Zulu-related pop-up village. It was used at Edge City in Chiang Mai. So that's something that Miriam specifically helped develop. So Miriam, I'd love to hear just about you and your involvement with this, and how you think like Meerkat, helped in the Zulu community, just foster some of the things that Veronica talked about.
I think what sets the movement of Susalu apart for me is, one, the organic virality. I think it started with one event, and then a year later it was already 50, and I don't know how many, or I don't know, at least it scaled very quickly. That's one. And then so a lot of people are interested in looking to contribute in such a movement and to these values. And then the second thing is also the topic of it. Like a lot of it is, like we've seen, privacy, biodefense, just in the DIAC manifesto, topics that aren't necessarily present at every other tech conference and haven't originally been like in the blockchain movement per se. And then the third part is the open source movement. And so I know Veronica is also aggregating all the different tools that are being used across the different pop-up cities, so whether it's Zulu or Edge City. And Meerkat was one of them. Maybe have some of you been to DEF CON maybe? Okay, so if you have engaged with a talk and checked in with your ZooPass ticket, then you might have used Meerkat there. So this is a minimal version of it without the ZooPass login. And it started as a DIP, which is a DEF CON improvement proposal. So working with the Ethereum Foundation and also with a company called Zero Xpark, which is developing software tools to make zero knowledge proofs more accessible to developers that are not maybe specialized in creating custom circuits. And so it was very great for us to be able to right away dive into ecosystems where people are willing to try out new tools, contribute with their data and their opinions. And I think because Zuzulu has such a privacy focus, it creates a safe environment for people to actively engage, and that's very critical to try out new tools and so on. So it's fully open source, of course, so everyone can use it. And yeah, it's very rewarding too as a project developer to develop something and right away get it into the hands of people who share the same values. So
That's great. So I want to turn it over to Alexis. Alexis, you're COO at NIM, and you guys are developing ZK Tech. That's broadly applicable to a number of fields. So tell us, like, what's your sort of experience with the Zuzalo ecosystem, and where do you see some of the stuff that you're working on fitting into what we're doing?
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm a bit on the edge of the Zuzalo ecosystem because I'm in Switzerland. I'm in the crypto ecosystem and the Bitcoin ecosystem for a long time, and I'm also like an activist in Switzerland for privacy and for digital rights. So I think all these comes a bit all together. So what I see is this link between an existing effort for many years from cypherpunk movements, and which are kind of reviving right now also through the lunar punk movement, they try to achieve privacy technology in a very radical way. And I think what is happening right now is to make the link between not just developing technology, but to have a vision of society that is actually an alternative to dystopian, centralized and transparent systems that we are building, that the world is building around us. And we'll talk a bit about later, but at the end it will be a game of incentives. And I think with the approach that we have from the blockchain world that is coming into this game, is that we can design systems that actually create a positive incentive, and we can have decentralized systems that have a better incentive than centralized system. And for people, is it in terms of wealth or in ability to communicate or whatever, they will be better off with the decentralized and private system.
Right. So let's pivot a little bit into the AI space, because we were talking incentives. So right now, there's a couple of interesting things happening in AI. You have your monolithic LLM companies, your OpenAIs, your Anthropics of the world sort of pushing forward. We now have this interesting thing that happened with DeepSeek, very aggressively lowering the cost that it takes to train and deploy these models, which has sort of been an interesting curveball, maybe a little bit unrelated to some of the decentralized stuff. But what's interesting about that team is they actually open sourced the model. So that was probably something that maybe was unexpected, but a positive development. But let's talk more about like the risks of what's been happening in like the corporate centralized LLM space. To you guys, like, what are some of the biggest risks with the monolithic centralized LLMs? And what are your thoughts on how some of the maybe stuff that's going on in decentralized AI, how can that be mitigated? Maybe let's differentiate. Let's also maybe think about decentralized AI as a crypto thing versus decentralized AI as an open source thing. Whoever would like to maybe start.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll jump in.
Sure.
So the two risks I see is first, when you have centralized AI systems built on scraping data around the world, they always tend to create biases that are depending on who is controlling, who's building this centralized AI. And DeepSeek is a very good example. Try ask something about Taiwan, and the message gets censored, right? So you will have these biases. So that's one. And the second thing, it's also like a very natural thing. If you have a bunch of people using a centralized system, the value tends to be acquired by the top. So you think you are gaining something with the usage of it, but the cost of you don't see the cost it actually is for you to participate in this. Your cost is your data, which is being sucked into this system. And it's going to be taken for free almost and compacted into these AI models and then reused and sold back to you. So basically, in reality, in terms of like economical balance, at the end, you might, as an individual, you might be losing. So these are the two risks. And so what privacy tech can bring to that is actually change that balance. So the first thing you can do is by hiding yourself, hiding your interaction and your whole community interaction, then all the data you are generating are not available for scrapers that will come and try to build models to learn from your data. That is not available, but it has to be done in a way which is more advanced than traditional privacy tech. This is what we're doing at NIM. We're creating noise, so that the pattern recognition systems that our AI cannot figure out what are the patterns of discussions that the people have. And what it will allow is that the people who live in a private environment then can develop their own models, and because I think using AI LLMs is something which is important. We want to use these tools in a beneficial way, but we can build them in a consensual way. It means that we know exactly what data goes in there. And we can defend from those nasty centralized AI who are crawling the web. So yeah, that's my view there.
Great. And Miriam, we learned about a project called Vana, which was like a user-owned data platform. Talk about maybe what is important about the idea of systems where the data is owned by the user, and also the user is maybe incentivized through like crypto economic incentives to provide that data. How does that maybe feed into like the DAC narrative?
Right. Yeah, I think the DAC narrative, we talked about this earlier a little bit, is somewhat of a social movement too. In a way, how I think about it is right now what you do for public goods is you vote every 4 years or so, but you don't actively shape the public healthcare system, for example, or what goes into biodefense, or help with public goods for cybersecurity, for example. But with contributing your data, which requires a lot more advancements in privacy tech than we do have now, there can be a world where you, as a citizen of X, not the platform, can contribute your data and help improve models in real time and help shape other areas of public goods other than governance, which we're shaping. So I think there's a lot of challenges with net new data DAOs where you contribute because it's small sets, it's niche data, and then there's complexities of how to combine all that data and which data is even valuable, and then how to prove and attest that it's good data and not made up or synthetic, and how to make sure that the model is not then hallucinating and things like that. But overall, I think it ties in very well with that's how it ties in my view, with the DAC movement, which is engaging based on a trust and safety level through tech more people into these public goods components of the system.
Awesome.
So briefly,
of course, yeah. I wanted to have you sort of talk about it through the context of Zuzulu, but if you're going to do that already.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, I was just going to quickly say that before Zuzulu, I was a Yukowski doomer, and like I was spending way too much time in rationalist meetup spaces in Europe, and then Vitalik actually invited our European rationalist community to Zuzulu, and so we were some of the groups not coming from like crypto or from AI longevity. There are these different industries, and then there were like the European rationalists there, and I actually found some of the most inspiring parts of Zuzelu, and then eventually DIAC, as he coined it, as just providing a path forward of saying maybe things look bad, maybe our probabilities look very, very, very bad, but stopping or trying to slow down is maybe impractical, if not impossible. So how can we move forward in a defensive way on the DIAC side, so a pathway forward, and on the Zuzelu side from the original one, and then I've seen in the dozens, if the more of subsequent projects that have come from it, it's bringing together also not just the thinkers and the worriers, the skeptics, the doubters, but builders that are very keen to try to solve these problems and say, okay, there's immense risk on the side of AI, even just in the hands of certain actors, or the bad traits in all people with the wrong incentives, etc. But it's been a space, both in these extended co-living experiments where you have these thinkers and builders together saying, all right, this is a crazy moment, like at the time of March through May 2023, and then it continues to be crazy moments. That's not changing, but at least bringing people together that want to try to solve somehow, or solve little pieces of the problem, like having zero knowledge proof in cryptographic technologies to at least provide more data privacy to the individuals, et cetera. So that's my main connection with Zuzelu and what it brought for me on a personal level, and that then also fueled the more professional side of things. So at least we're trying to move forward in a cautiously optimistic way. And that's where I think in the My Techno Optimism article, the first one he wrote, and then he just published another one a couple weeks ago, that was an update. I think if you're similarly feeling concerned or skeptical and worried about direction, it does provide at least some type of philosophical fire to try, at least while we still can.
Yeah, and just speaking from my personal experience, I spent a lot of my time in my day job at Cosimo researching a protocol called BitTensor, which is kind of started the decentralized AI crypto narrative. And if the one thing that we can do to maybe counteract some of these centralized things is offer people economic incentives. Vitalik pushes for the idea of choice. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a philosophical argument that like, hey, the decentralized good, open source good. It can also be that open source tech can be incentivized through crypto monetary incentives to help us beat centralized companies. And I think BitTensor is an interesting project that's doing that right now. All right, let's move on a little bit to privacy, biodefense, safety, sort of beyond decentralized AI for things like, just for things like biosafety. So what are some individual freedoms? So obviously health, privacy, safety. Why are these so important for sustaining Zuzelu? So let's think about our current political context right now, right? We have sort of a rising tide of authoritarianism in the world, leaders who are pushing for more centralized control, top-down governance. And you think about a system or a community like Zuzelu, which is sort of like this ragtag group of nomads traveling the world talking about decentralization. What sort of threats do these like centralized nation-state governments pose to us? And what's at stake if we just overlook this stuff and just say like, well, we can always do these experiments because we have been able to up to this point. I don't know who wants to start, maybe Veronica.
Like what's at stake?
Yeah.
This is recorded, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess also just seeing the second question, why would any nation allow true sovereignty, et cetera, I would try to approach both questions at once. I would say within the Zuzelu movement as a whole, there are a number of different projects with different levels of ambition, and certain industries have real stake in needing some type of jurisdictional freedoms, especially when it comes to maybe regulation. I think we've seen within this larger ecosystem, longevity, and then of course Web3 are two directions that struggle in a lot of existing jurisdictions to, like on the longevity side, for the valley of death in between where research on a molecule to then eventually get into the right like levels of trials, eventually then being able to be made into a medication. There's a lot of bureaucratic barriers, and so that's where we've seen projects that want some type of special zone or need some type of special jurisdiction really go in that direction. And then what's at stake is they don't have, for those type of researchers, they don't have an area in the world where they could actually test their, maybe they have really promising research on one scale, but they can't take it to another level and have humans try it, et cetera. So that's one direction where we would see it. And why would a nation allow for this? What we've seen is if a nation sees a project as bringing in some type of resources, whether it's talent or capital, or they think of it just maybe as special tourism, or there's a special zone that's going to bring in that many more people. We've also seen representatives from nations express wanting to reduce brain drain, and so we see maybe we're still in early stages, of course, but long term, if there are institutions that then, or let alone industries, cities that can compete with the existing strong cities that usually drain the top talent from around the world, then that's also attractive for leaders that say, all of our top minds are leaving to go to XYZ place, and they never come back. How can we get them to stay here? So those are reasons that there might be, jurisdictional freedoms that then are allowed on a nation side, and then reasons that, these projects with different levels of ambition, not all of them want to get sovereignty by any means, but that's where we've seen at least examples so far, and what I feel comfortable saying right now on camera.
Understood. So I'll let you guys decide who wants to take sort of a flavor of the same question, but what are some of your concerns about privacy and safety, and what are you seeing in our ecosystem that's helping foster that and potentially protect against nation state actors attempting to take some of this stuff away from us?
Okay, so I will have one thought that I will share is that what will happen with the technology that we are building is that sometimes, or very often actually, it might not be used by the people we we were thinking of, and basically you will have state actors that will be using those tools, and actually sometimes even using the same tools to make their own regime stronger. That also can happen. And I'm taking like one simple example that we all know. Bitcoin is a decentralized tool, which has there is a utopia of the people who are building Bitcoin, and it's already been taken by a state actor who's centralizing a lot of part of it. I'm thinking of El Salvador. Where you have a very authoritarian regime, or somehow authoritarian regime in a certain way, that is taking Bitcoin as a tool, and actually many Bitcoiners are troubled by this phenomenon, and so we will have the same kind of things happening. So we have to reach a point where, and I think we have to build a very strong political or a utopia vision of what the society could look like, so that people also can embrace these kind of technology with a larger vision, because otherwise, we will have this step where these technologies will be taken by not the people we expected to have. So that will be one of the biggest challenge that we see forward.
Fair. Miriam, do you have a take?
Alexis has worked for the UN before, so his view is probably a little more informed there. I do get the point with the longevity movement, which has or special economic zones, where this could be a little bit more in focus. I think at the moment the movement is still very small, so I haven't heard of it being an actual problem as of now, and in the medical field, like doing some research on humans, I don't know how far that goes actually, so I don't know if nation states would bother about it. And in terms of open source software, I think states also require software, like the healthcare system in Germany is using Matrix. servers to communicate with each other, the different institutions. They work with crypto companies developing secure enclaves in some of their institutions. So there's a lot of mutual requirement to move forward in the best interest of what's best for the people. So taking the optimistic view here and saying that by experimenting, many more than just the people at Susalu can benefit by being exposed to these technologies. And if I hear things from like the CCC and how hackable so much of public infrastructure is, I think states require people and not just white hat hackers and a few select to work on these topics, especially like privacy tech. So my view is, thanks. Yeah, this is beneficial for more than its own sake.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we have a good 13 minutes left, and it looks like you guys are killing it using Meerkat because we have like a bunch of questions. They're being upvoted. So let's dive into some of these. Let's see what the audience wants to talk about. So top rated question, what are the risks and downsides to DIAC and pop-up cities? What are the risks? What are we doing badly here? Potentially. Anybody wants to take it first?
Yeah, I mean, pop-up cities, I think that if Susalu gets reduced to just pop-up cities or is thought of as only pop-up cities, then that's already a shame or that's a downside because it's become so much more, and it began with a pop-up city, and we're seeing this model of pop-up cities be continued, I think, in some ways because it works, it makes sense for especially more nomadic crowds to, instead of just going for a short amount of time, go for a bit longer. But as mentioned, we're increasingly seeing the movement towards permanent hubs. But then when we have permanent hubs, pop-up cities are a good model to bring a lot of people there for a short amount of time. So we'll keep seeing that, but it's not that alone. At the same time, what are the downsides to it other than it just becoming glorified retreats that have a different name? Would also be, it's been a consistent difficulty for these temporary pop-up cities to be financially sustainable. It's especially when it's organized and it's including co-living, and then it's a very expensive hotel, which may be necessary in parts of the world to have security, which can't be ignored, but then it again is becoming like a fancy extended retreat offsite type thing, and maybe is missing these larger ambitions or the potential that I think Susalu really has to build alternatives digitally and physically to the existing places that we have. I think risks, where I see the benefit of the movement being fairly decentralized is that people can move freely between them. We even saw in Chiang Mai last fall where there were a bunch happening at the same time. Some people were kicked out of one or didn't like one, and then they just went to another one. And that was a nice, true moment of, okay, this is proving exit with low exit costs. Then you can have a lot of different projects happening where they have strong opinions on what is happening within that project. I think where I was especially concerned in the first year of Susalu, but I've been happy it's moved very far away from this direction, was if there was like global governance or it becomes a cult of personality or a cult just in general. I think that's why I've also been just very actively proponent of calling it a movement too, and not a community of the people that happen to be at this first one, or however people would try to define this singular community. So that's where I would say pop-up cities, like any pop-up city could have those same risks that any group of humans coming together trying to coordinate, let alone live or start a new society would have. And where I see the decentralization piece quite key. DIAC, I think we could also speak to the risks and downsides if you want to jump in, or
Vlad, I was
Vlad?
curious, what about you?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I actually had teed up a follow-up in my mind because somebody early on when we had this Meerkat on wrote, "Fuck longevity." Whoever, if you want to own it, please raise your hand because I think that's totally fine. And it said, "Live better, not longer." I'm sorry, you're very unlucky. I have a good memory with these things. So let's talk about longevity, because I think that's an interesting one, because I have a perspective, when I first heard about the longevity movement, and especially within the context of these pop-up villages, it's like, oh, like you have a bunch of like wealthy, privileged people who want to live longer. Like, shouldn't we focus on public health as like curing diseases and things that are like more pressing general population issues? And so I want to maybe get your perspectives on what you think of longevity, and whether you think like maybe I'm missing something here, like whether by attacking longevity we actually do solve those problems.
I mean, yeah, I think there is a part of truth to that there's rich people who invest money into cryopreservation and life extension technologies like that. And then there's also a part where it's just live better longer, and there's knowledge is being spread about how to treat your injuries better, or how to do more preventative health care in terms of blood tests and so on. I personally have definitely been exposed to both sides, and there's this whole DeSci movement going on where it's about how can we collectively be incentivized to come up with innovation faster, for example, or target niche diseases that some people suffer from, but it's not on top of the list for big pharma companies. And so I think it goes beyond longevity. It's still very early and very speculative, and I think that's what these movements help with, to figure out where this is going and have smart people give their input on it.
Yeah, I want to make a comment, not from me, from a friend who's a cypherpunk called Maxim Orlovsky. Maybe some of you know him. And so he made on his blog a very interesting thing where he mentions longevity. And I think what he says, he really wants to live as long as possible. And he thinks even the human race will find a way to live forever. And I think I don't have this wish myself, but I think there's so many people around the world that want to, that I think it's quite inevitable, right? That's the first part. But then once you push yourself into a society where like no one dies, what happens in the structure of power of the people? And basically you have a tendency to centralization, like I was saying before. Power goes more and more into the few. So a transparent society where people would live forever would basically be a society made of mostly kind of slave people and a few dozen controlling people. And so how do you reverse this? Well, is by making the weaker one invisible to the stronger one. And that's where privacy tech comes in, right? So actually longevity, if you're not one of the top 10 people who are controlling the world, if you want to live a long life, you have an incentive of very strong privacy.
I could debate longevity with anyone that wants to, but I think a lot of arguments against like current longevity research or funding, you could say, you could go back 100 years and then ask them like penicillin, like who has access to penicillin or who can afford to use XYZ, like, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head of how long people were living 100 years ago compared to how long we're living on average now, and ask them, and then they say, oh, that's unnatural, we don't want to extend life X amount of time. I think I could debate this for a while, because I did get quite longevity pilled some time ago, and I think that on an individual level you can think of like live forever or die trying. Maybe you think it's a very unlikely, it's very, very unlikely that you will live forever, but if you try to think long term, then maybe you're going to make better decisions on an individual level of, okay, well, maybe I won't be as self-destructive as I usually am because I want to live tomorrow. And most people would say that they want to live tomorrow, and if you ask yourself, when do you want to die, then ask yourself at that point still, do you want to die now? Are you ready? And maybe it's to, there's some reasons to keep living, curiosity, family, etc. And then again, when it, all tech, like you can look at, when tech comes out, the price of it, and then over time, it becoming more widespread. I think there's really valid concerns when it comes to enshrining power, but I think that those are not exclusive to longevity. I think we already have those issues, and there's something like, dictators aren't dying of old age. Usually it's other reasons that's overthrowing them. But not to say that those risks aren't still there, and that's why we need defensive acceleration.
Fair. Okay, so I think we have time for one more. The top-rated question we have up here right now is, do you have examples of tools being built by the Roussel community? We talked about some of those already, and I wanted to sort of build on that question, something that I thought of shortly before this panel, which is, what happens in terms of the ethos of open source, of the open source community, specifically maybe Roussel, when a team that's building an open source tool sort of finds like pretty significant product market fit and they want to commercialize, they maybe want to start a for-profit company. What are your perspectives on where that puts them in sort of like the DAC versus EAC bucket? Like, is this like sort of a betrayal of the ethos, or is there ways we can support these teams to sort of go for the more like for-profit route?
I have an answer. I think the defensive approach can be something that can be designed fundamentally in the society where it actually strives business. And having a business in privacy or in decentralization is actually a good thing, and it will actually provide value to the whole society. And it's not incompatible, right? But you're right that sometimes, and this is a tendency, like you start off with a vision which is very optimistic and decentralized and very morally that feels good, and then you are facing the reality of, I need to survive, and that my product needs to be sold somehow and make money, and then you switch. You're making shortcuts that sees this. But fundamentally, I think that having a system with exchange of value, and this I think it's there's a question about free and open source software also. There is realization now that you can build tech for and common goods with the notion of value being not a taboo, right? The value of Bitcoin, the value of Ether, it's something which is not a taboo for us, which is still for a lot of people in the open source communities, because they've been, and I was part of that too. I'm part of that too. And for years and years, there was no cryptocurrency, and we were building a world where we had sharing economy, and and money was bad. But suddenly, with open source, we build money, and we build systems where we can exchange stuff. And I think it's not incompatible, but we have to be, of course, true to the open source principles.
Yeah, I would also say, like, for the practical example of Meerkat, which obviously is fully open source, and these projects can start off working with a grant, but then you can say, okay, I can do the EAC way, and I can start to do a SaaS software based out of it. I can keep it fully open source, or I can find a middle ground where I could start up a data DAO for the questions contributed, and turn it into, find new incentive mechanisms, which goes into the middle way. And all of these are valid paths. I think some are more supported in the current ecosystem, like you could go the Gitcoin route, or you could go the VC route, or find your own token project way in the middle. But maybe that's something for Roussel to build out upon and support projects. But I would love to actually bring this back as the last thing to Veronica and go into, like, on the question, examples of tools beyond Meerkat and like maybe different categories, and which winners you have seen so far and how far they've taken it.
Sure, and I see under minutes, I'll be very fast, and I'll also answer the question that at least for Zuzu.city, we are neutral, and so we are not saying you have to be open source, you have to follow all of these specific values. We want to incentivize or nudge people to work in that direction, but ultimately be neutral. So we have a permissionless app store that is the first version launching maybe this week, next week, but what's required is that you're transparent on whether you are open source, where are the smart contracts, et cetera. And then with the pensive mechanism, with Ethereum Community Fund and other evaluation tools, then finding ways of, having algorithm that can list the priorities or the preferences, and not every community that we envision using the community OS is going to care about open source or care about it being truly decentralized databases, Web3. We want to give that decision to allow that as many decisions to be to the user as possible. I think we get into the most like bickering with our team whether things are neutral enough, and if there's any slight decision made, then we try to backtrack and say, no, this has to be neutral, but still, because privacy first and use our own data, those transparency, legitimacy, these are all our values, and that doesn't exist in alternatives. That's why we make sure that at least those options are there. And so when it comes to Zuzlu software broadly in these tools, we also see it as inevitable, or it's necessary for tools to have not be fully open source, not fully decentralized, and maybe they need to get funding along the way. And so we want to acknowledge that that is a part of the process at the same time. So asking what type of tools, and we have the categories, and I wrote it to make sure. So of course there's identity, decentralized identity, governance modules, economic modules, communication, social, and then the event scheduling modules. So those are some of the different verticals where we have different, or we have tools at different levels of usability for it. And especially on the financial ones, or the funding module, that is one of our main focuses at the moment, so that communities, whether it's another question about pop-up cities or it's the projects themselves, tech projects can start to fund themselves in a more grassroots way and not have to go the traditional routes. But until we are in this utopian environment where, you know, open source tools and developers are able to make it work and justify it compared to alternatives, then we want to support those as well. So some quick examples. I mean, one, I think, really strong example that we saw in the last year is Lotto PGF, which does on-chain lotteries for public goods funding. And of course, they have the backing of, you know, thousands of years of states or, you know, institutions using lotteries to fund public goods, and that's what they're matching as one example. And so that's one module, financial module on the Zuzlu.city platform that we have brought in to help give an alternative. So that's the long, rambling way of saying, yes, we want to stay neutral, but nudge applications ultimately to be moving in the direction without us having to say this is exactly what needs to be done. Yeah, you can check out, I know we're out of time, to see more examples of tools. We also have if you go to Zuzlu.city, you can click on our documentation, and we're continuously working on updating that, and then look out in the coming weeks also for the first version of our permissionless dApp store, to then see the really amazing tools that are being built in the Zuzlu software movement.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we're out of time, so I want to thank my panelists for being awesome and answering all these questions. And I want to thank you guys for participating and submitting questions. We had a lot of participation, so thank you very much for coming, and hope you have a great rest of your conference.